There lived a woman named Amira in a small town close to a busy city in South Asia. The town Amira lived is not a place people go for sightseeing, it's just ordinary. A few narrow streets, little shops lined up together, buses honking as they pass, and the smell of spices and frying bread drifting through the air. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and neighbors often keep an eye on each other's lives. Amira wasn't famous, she wasn't wealthy, and she didn't hold any big position in society. But if you asked anyone in the neighborhood about her, they'd smile and say the same thing: Amira makes the best chai you'll ever drink. Everyone simply called her Amira Baji, a term of respect meaning, Sister Amira. Now, Amira's story didn't begin with tragedy. Like many young women, she married in her early 20s. Her husband, Faisal, was a mechanic who ran a modest motorcycle repair shop. They didn't have much, but they had enough. Faisal worked with greasy hands and long hours, while Amira managed the home, cooked meals, and looked after their 3 children. Life was simple. Money was tight, but there was laughter in the evenings when Faisal came home. They shared tea at the end of the day, the kids would chatter about school, and Amira would sometimes joke that Faisal's hands smelled more like oil than food. They weren't rich, but they had a rhythm, a life that felt steady. But life, as we know, has a way of throwing storms when least expected. One morning, Faisal complained of chest pain. He was only 39, far too young for anyone to think the worst. But within hours, everything changed. A heart attack took him, just like that. No warnings. No second chances. Amira's world crumbled in a single day. She was left standing in a silent house, staring at 3 children whose eyes were filled with questions she didn't know how to answer. Overnight, she went from wife to widow, from homemaker to the only person who could keep the family alive. And in that moment, the whispers began. Poor woman, what will she do now? She should move in with her brother. How can a woman like her raise 3 children alone? The world was already writing her future for her, one of dependence, helplessness, and quiet defeat. But Amira had something inside her that no one saw yet, a strength built not from loud speeches or grand gestures, but from quiet determination. The morning after Faisal's funeral, Amira could barely breathe. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her body heavy with grief. But when she looked at her children, her eldest daughter barely a teenager, her 2 sons still small, something shifted. She knew she couldn't afford to collapse. So she did something unexpected. She lit the stove. She brewed her usual strong spiced chai, the same tea her neighbors always praised. And instead of pouring it into cups for her family, she poured it into an old thermos. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, slipped on her worn sandals, and walked to the bus stop at the edge of town. The buses there were always crowded with workers rushing to the city. Men waited in lines, talking loudly, yawning, sometimes arguing. Amira walked straight into the middle of them, heart pounding, and softly called out. Hot chai, 5 rupees a cup. For a moment, people stared. Some frowned. Some whispered. A woman selling tea? That was unusual, even shocking. One man chuckled and said, she's fallen from grace. Another shook his head as if pitying her. But a few curious workers stepped forward. They tasted her tea. They nodded. And the next day, they came back for more. Amira's hands trembled as she poured those first cups. Her grief was still raw. But her voice stayed steady, and her eyes, though red from crying, carried quiet resolve. Day after day, she returned. By the end of the week, she was selling enough cups to buy more milk, more sugar, and even cheap plastic cups so she didn't have to wash the same ones over and over. Within a month, she saved enough to buy a small wooden table. On that table, she added fresh parathas, hot, flaky bread that paired perfectly with chai. Slowly, her little spot at the bus stop turned into something people looked forward to. Workers would wave at her, greet her kindly, and even defend her when others mocked. But let's be clear, this wasn't easy. Amira was judged constantly. Some said she was shameless for standing in the street. Others claimed she should rely on relatives instead of working. There were days her body ached from exhaustion, nights she cried herself to sleep, mornings she doubted she could keep going. Yet, every dawn, she lit the stove again. She tied her hair back, filled the thermos, and carried her dignity with her to that bus stop. Years passed. The whispers that once mocked her faded. Respect replaced ridicule. People no longer called her the poor widow. They called her Chai Amma, the mother of tea. Her tea stall expanded into a tiny roadside cafe, built with wood and tin. It wasn't fancy, but it had warmth. Travelers stopped for her steaming chai, neighbors gathered at her tables, and children carried parathas wrapped in paper. Meanwhile, her children grew alongside her business. Her daughter became a teacher, guiding classrooms full of young girls. Her eldest son trained as an electrician, fixing wires and lights. And her youngest son? He grew up watching his mother pour tea with steady hands and eventually took over the cafe himself, proudly naming it Amira's Chai. One afternoon, a journalist visited her cafe, curious about her story. He sat with his notebook and asked, "Weren't you ever afraid? Didn't you fear what people would say?" Amira smiled gently, her eyes carrying years of struggle and triumph. And she said words that would later echo in newspapers and inspire many. "Of course I was afraid. But fear doesn't boil water. Fear doesn't feed children. I had mouths to feed. Giving up was never an option." Amira's story is not the tale of a woman who became rich or famous. She didn't build an empire or make headlines across the world. But what she built was far greater: dignity, resilience, and a future for her children. She turned her grief into grit, her sorrow into strength, and her tears into tea that carried not just flavor, but hope. And in her journey, there's a lesson for all of us. Strength doesn't always look like roaring lions or grand victories. Sometimes, it looks like a tired woman who wakes up before dawn, ties her shawl, and chooses not to give up, again and again. It reminds us that real power isn't in avoiding hardship, but in facing it head-on, even when our hands are shaking. It's in making small choices every day that lead to a bigger, brighter tomorrow. For Amira, her courage didn't just change her own life. It gave her children education, opportunity, and pride. It turned whispers of pity into words of respect. And it built a legacy that lives on through a humble cafe where every cup of chai carries the taste of resilience. So the next time life knocks you down and the world whispers, "You can't do it," remember Amira's words. Fear doesn't boil water. Courage, determination, and love, those are the ingredients that keep us moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of strength we all need to brew in our own lives.